I want to have a little section about Robert Fine. This is called the Robert Fine Memorial Lecture. It is, in fact, the annual Robert Fine Memorial Lecture. Robert Fine was very important to me. He was a mentor to me and a friend to me, and he was my PhD supervisor. There are at least 3 of Robert's students in this building. I hope there are more, I don't know. Robert was actually, in my view, an extraordinary sociologist. In fact, in the new book, I begin the book with prefaces for a piece that Robert wrote, also a piece that Norman Garras wrote. And both of those in their way are kind of foundational to this work, and I think probably to our centre as well. It's interesting that both of them were Jewish boys, Jewish Marxists, Jewish academics. Both of them came to the serious study of anti-Semitism relatively late in their lives, which I think is interesting and is not random. I don't want to go on too much. Robert was an extraordinary democratic thinker, and I'm really proud that hopefully his name will live on in this annual event for a very long time. I want to introduce 2 people who are going to talk about Robert. One of them is Daniel Chernilo, who's going to come on second, who was a student of Robert's, is now a professor of social theory in Santiago, in Chile, also at Loughborough. But first, I want to introduce you to Lydia Morris, who was Robert's partner and who is a professor of sociology at Essex University. Lydia.
Well, hello, everybody. When I was first invited to open this session, Why We Remember Robert Fine, my first thought was, well, I remember Robert Fine as the most cussed, contrary and stubborn person I have ever met. But I also remember a person of kindness, tolerance and patience, though that could sometimes be the patience of a tiger waiting to pounce. But certainly these 2 strands of dogged assertion and quiet consideration ran through Robert's personality. And I think they were deployed to good effect in his work, both politically and intellectually. He never took anything at face value. He would always try to think against the grain, and he could play a long game with his arguments. He never went for the easy reading or the most apparent meaning without digging deeper, grappling with the difficulties, ambiguities, and uncertainties of a text. So for him, any puzzling distractions in an argument were not to be overlooked, but were to be interrogated. And I think we can learn from Robert to be both stubborn and patient in that regard. So to think against the grain, not to settle for easy solutions. And this requires a certain doggedness, persistence, and yes, I would say a certain cussedness. It can also require a degree of moral courage, which I think Robert did possess, alongside, for him, the need for an audience, and perhaps especially a hostile audience. In fact, Robert showed a readiness to engage with people and ideas that differed from his own, maybe even sort them out. This can be seen in aspects of his writing. If I take, for example, his book on cosmopolitanism, which was one of the key ideas books in the Routledge series, I think the book really provides a distillation of Robert's own key ideas and this commitment to thinking with complexity. He notes how the rhetoric of a universal class can be turned to the interests not of humanity as a whole, but of a brutal totalitarianism. He also recognises how nationalism can be a coming together against oppression, but can also risk reinterpretation as arbitrary exclusion. So this takes him to the argument that between universalist ideals and particularist sentiment, there's a complex dialectic, and the outcome evades any simple solution. And so this leads on to his statement, we do not live in a cosmopolitan age, but in an age of cosmopolitanism, with the follow-up argument, everything of interest is to be found in the in-between. And he was certainly interested always in interrogating that murky in-between terrain. This speaks to the importance for Robert of wedding academic work with political sensibility, and vice versa. It's apparent in much of Robert's personal history, but it's also there in his writing. So movement, metamorphosis, and tension are seen as the recurrent expression of encounters between the universal and the particular, and hence as key characteristics of the cosmopolitan condition. Underpinning much of his writing and thinking is a readiness to criticise, but a wariness of trashing. And Robert's thinking with complexity filtered through to his critique of critique. We see this in his insistence that criticism of Israel can be found in uncomfortable proximity to anti-Semitism. And he would have that sensibility while still holding on to his own right to be critical. So why do we remember Robert Fine? We remember him because he was cussed and contrary, because he wouldn't take the easy route, and because he insisted on thinking, often to the discomfort of both himself and others. And I think this is the spirit we should try to preserve. I'll hand over now to Daniel.
Good evening, everyone. It's fantastic to be here, to be among friends, to be remembering Robert Fine and his work and his legacy. And also it's wonderful to think how he would have been so proud of David's work and the work where the center is putting forward. So I'll just read a few words about his work. Robert Fine had a permanent interest in and devoted just the last decade of his writing to understanding and combating anti-Semitism. His texts are political as well as scholarly, historical as well as theoretical, committed as well as critical. To my mind, the main idea that transpires from his work is that anti-Semitism represents the total reversal of a progressive cosmopolitan project in its exclusionary logic, in its poisonous politics, in its dehumanizing implication, in its various invidious phases. Anti-Semitism offers an inverted image of cosmopolitan ideas of global solidarity, universal human rights, and even equality before the law. To Robert Fine, this inversion is not new, but is already apparent in how, right from the 18th century debates on the so-called Jewish question, a stake was neither just a question, nor did it concern only Jews themselves. Instead, this very formulation, the Jewish question, expressed the twisted intuition in which the victims of hatred are charged with the causes of their own misery. It was a way of making Jews responsible for the antipathy they naturally generate. This is why, for Robert, it's so central that all Jewish questions are understood by what they are, anti-Semitism questions. Inevitably, they lead to making anti-Semitism seem respectable, reasonable, unavoidable even. Robert was particularly interested in three figurations of contemporary anti-Semitism. The three remain wholly pertinent for our own times. The three are closely intertwined, and the three are likely to remain central, I think, in the years to come. The first set of issues has to do with the ways in which anti-Semitism has taken hold of discourses in the political left, whether in the slippage of language, when Jews are referred to as mere Zionists, whether in the demonization of Israel. Robert Fine underscores the deeply anti-Semitic logic, I quote, that depicts Israel as a uniquely illegitimate state, Zionism as a uniquely noxious ideology, supporters of Israel as a uniquely powerful lobby, and collective memory of the Holocaust as a uniquely self-serving reference to the past. Beneath the surface of this political argument, he says, we hear echoes of old anti-Semitic tropes: conspiracy theory, blood libel, national betrayal, the secret of global power. The second theme is a difficulty we find even within critics of anti-Semitism, who argue now that anti-Semitism was indeed a real problem, but is now mostly confined to the past. The note of caution here is for those who think that Islamophobia play in the present the role that anti-Semitism did play during the 19th and 20th centuries. Robert Fine argues against those views in which, and I quote again, the issue no longer appeared to be whether Jews can be good Germans or good Frenchmen, but whether Muslims can be good Europeans. It is as though the transition from European nationalisms to European post-nationalism accounts for the apparent insignificance of contemporary anti-Semitism, for the philo-Semitic reconfiguration of Jews as the oldest Europeans, and for the growing significance of Islamophobia. The third and final theme has to do with the connections between anti-Semitism and other forms of racism. Here, Robert Fine's argument focuses on the violence that inheres in the homogenizing logic that treats human groups as undivided wholes, on the one hand, and the invidious logic of making different forms of discrimination compete for political sympathy, on the other. He contends that we need to understand what connects rather than what separates different forms of racism and discrimination. The central premise is that understanding and fighting one form of racism ought to help us understand more fully and fight more decidedly against all others. Progressive solidarity with oppressed groups is not a zero-sum game, as if there is a fixed quantity of it that can be distributed only up to a certain limit. Universalistic values of autonomy, freedom, solidarity, and emancipation are not only to be upheld for all cases, but they also mutually learn from and support one another. In the present, as we witness every day, the opposite attitude seems to be the case, and different forms of racism tend to be seen in opposition to one another. The presence of anti-Semitic discourse and anti-Semitic discrimination is a proxy for the moral integrity of our societies as a whole. Modern anti-Semitism achieves salience in political life and continues to do so because it underscores the critical distance between the legal status of the citizen of a particular community and our moral status as human beings. To the extent that openly racial thinking about Jews is perhaps less prevalent than it once was, this has not, as we sadly know, signaled the demise of other forms of anti-Semitism. It merely allows it to reappear in different forms. This is why the job of the London Centre, I think, is so important, and this is why its annual lecture is inspired by Robert Fine's legacy. Thank you.